What's up, friends? It's Alexander, and this is the Tip Jar. Every week or so, you have an opportunity on Instagram through my stories to ask a question, any question you have about coffee. I collect all those questions, then I post 2 at a time, and with a poll, you decide which one I answer. Now, this is no definitive answer on anything. This is just my opinion and how I feel about it. So today, we're talking about acid. This question asks, what's with acidity? How do I select a coffee when thinking about acidity levels, and how does it come into play? That's a great question because I'm addicted to acid. I just love acid in foods and fruits, and you might not even know that there are acids in coffee, and surely there are. 4 of the ones we're going to talk about today are citric acid, malic acid, lactic acid, and acetic acid. All of these acids are naturally occurring in the coffee fruit, and that's because coffee is a fruit. Think about it. Most experiences you have with acid in the kitchen or in the restaurant or in the grocery store are associated with fruits usually, like, lemons or limes or peaches or whatever. Right now in Niagara, we're in the height of stone fruit season. Just came out of apricots and nectarines. Now we're eating peaches. It's my favorite time of year because those fruits are just as sweet as they are acidic. And that's what I love about them. And coffee's no different because it is a fruit. It's a cherry, and it looks kind of like the red cherries that you might be familiar with wherever you are. We grow cherries here in Niagara as well, but maybe you just find them in the grocery store. It's really familiar to the coffee fruit, and the coffee bean is just the seed from inside that cherry. That's another monologue for another time, asking why we call them beans instead of seeds, but that's besides the point. So if you think about a cherry and think about how acidic it is, similar with coffee. So the acids that we find in our final cup in the brewed coffee that we drink are naturally occurring in the fruit itself. And the acids are developed over time as the fruit ripens. And so that's why you'll find higher contents of acid in coffees that are grown at higher elevations, because at higher elevations there's less oxygen and the fruit actually takes longer to ripen. So a longer maturation process means more acids have the opportunity to develop, same with sugars. And that's why those coffees that are grown higher are so unique. So let's talk about acids for a second. I have a friend, Emily Bryant. She is a barista, an Instagrammer. You've probably seen her. She is the latte art champion of the world. But she's just as addicted to acid as I am. In fact, probably more so. She buys food grade acids like malic acid and citric acid, and she'll dissolve them into a liquid and put them in little spray bottles and spray them on her tongue when she just needs a little hit, or spritz them on a dish, a dessert, or whatever. And that's not unique to her. That's not uncommon. I mean, maybe storing it in your purse is unique to her, but it's not uncommon when it comes to food and dessert. A lot of chefs or home food enthusiasts will do that very thing. They'll add food grade citric acid or malic acid just to kind of boost what a dish has to offer. So when you're looking at flavor notes and considering flavor notes of coffee, and we're thinking about notes like lemon or lime, that's a reference to citric acid, probably the most familiar one. Think about tasting notes like green apple or pear or peach. That's malic acid. You might not know that, but now you do. Acetic acid is a little bit different. It's actually the primary ingredient in vinegar, and that doesn't sound like anything you'd want to taste in your coffee. It's actually produced during the processing period and the roasting process of your coffee, and it's not as distinguishable to your palate as citric or malic acid. It doesn't play that kind of part, but it does play an important part in the structure of what you taste and how you taste it. And lactic acid is one of my favorites. It's pretty reminiscent to anything that you might think there would be lactic acid in, like yogurt or milk or cream or your favorite milkshake IPA. It's that creamy mouthfeel. Maybe you've had a coffee that had that creamy mouthfeel, maybe even gone through a lactic fermentation. So those are the 4 predominant acids in coffees. That's not a conclusive list, but 4 of the most predominant acids in coffees, and they can be accentuated or diminished through a couple things, primarily the process that the coffee went through, and then the roasting process as well. So as far as processing the fruit goes, washed coffees are naturally higher in acid compared to natural coffees, who kind of diminish the acidity of the coffee but accentuate the sweetness. And then when it comes to roasting the coffee, darker roasted coffee is going to be less acidic. Those citric and malic acids are going to be less distinguishable than in lighter roasted coffee. And maybe you've had that experience. You might like dark roast coffee, and that's fine. But dark roast coffee kind of just tastes like dark roast coffee. It tastes like coffee, right? And for some of us, that's comfortable. But a lighter roasted coffee from, let's use a country like Ethiopia as an example, where it's grown at higher elevations, is going to have higher quantities of acid in that cup. And so that's why those washed Ethiopians just have that bright lemon note, or the washed Kenyans have that bright lime or grapefruit note. And it has a lot to do with where they were grown, but also how they were roasted. If they're roasted lighter, it gives an opportunity for that acid to sink. So when it comes to the actual question, how do I shop for coffees based off their acidity? I want to touch on that just for a moment. How do we shop for coffees? And then once you buy a coffee, how do we brew coffees in order to diminish or accentuate the acidity? So shopping for coffees, you're going to want to look at the label and note a couple things. First things first, let's look at elevation. So I said earlier that the higher a coffee is grown, the more acids are going to be naturally present usually in that fruit, in that seed, and in that coffee. So the reason for that is because there's less oxygen, less opportunity for respirations up there, a longer maturation process. And so when you look at the bag, you're going to see elevation. Hopefully you'll see that on the label. And then a number, and it's going to be signified by meters above sea level. So if you're looking at a bag and you're shopping for a coffee from Mexico that's grown at 1,000 meters above sea level, that fruit is going to be naturally lower in acidity compared to a coffee that's grown in the mountains in Ethiopia that was grown at 2,200 meters above sea level. So first things first, take a look at the elevation, see how high was this coffee grown, and what opportunity did this fruit have to produce those acids naturally. Next, we touched on it again earlier, take a look at the process. If it's a washed coffee, in the processing, the acids had an opportunity to remain and then will have an opportunity to shine through the coffee, compared to a natural process where the acids are going to be diminished a little bit. The sweetness is going to be accentuated. The body might be accentuated. But as far as acids go, they might be less distinguishable in that naturally processed coffee. And so you can expect high contents of citric and malic acid in coffees, washed coffees from Ethiopia, Kenya, Colombia. And then if you're looking at coffees, whether they're washed or naturally processed from Mexico or Brazil or Honduras, you can expect lower contents of acid in those coffees. So now you've bought your coffees, you brought them home, and you're brewing your coffee. There's actually a way to either accentuate or diminish acid in coffee at home, regardless of what coffee you bought. Now, of course, the coffees that are lighter roasted and grown higher, you're going to have a better opportunity to extract those acids and then taste them in your cup. So first things first, acid requires heat to be extracted. So the general rule of thumb is the higher heat you use to brew your coffee, the higher amount of acid, or the higher opportunity you have to extract acid in your cup. That's why cold brew tastes the way it does. And in my opinion, that's why cold brew is so popular, because generally it's pretty low in acid. It's not a very acidic drink at all. That's why it's really approachable. That's why so many people enjoy it. That's also why it's not one of my favorite drinks, because although it's brewed for a long amount of time, it's brewed at really low water temperatures, sometimes like actually cold water temperatures. So there's a ceiling to which how much acid you can extract from that coffee because you've chosen to use a lower water temperature. At my coffee company, Groundswell, one of our featured drinks this summer was a cold brew and lemonade. Maybe you've never heard of that before. A lot of our customers had never heard of it before. They saw it on the feature menu and asked, like, what is that? And I said, well, you know what, just try it. So I pour them. It's 1-to-1 ratio of our cold brew and lemonade. And they would taste it and say, wow, that works. And I said, well, of course it does, because what cold brew inherently lacks, acid and sweetness, we just add back with lemonade, which is very acidic and very sweet. And so it adds back to the cold brew what the coffee never let out, what the coffee never extracted, because you didn't brew it at a high temperature. So an easy thing for you is to set your kettle, whether you have a variable temperature kettle like I do, the fellow Stag, or even a stovetop kettle, just brew right off the boil. So my kettle is set to 210 degrees Fahrenheit. That's just 2 degrees less than boiling. If you boil your kettle on the stovetop, or you don't have temperature control, once you take it off the stove or off the heating element, That's called off boil, and you can start brewing right away. So the higher the temperature, the more opportunity you're going to have to extract those acids. And no, you can't burn your coffee with hot water. That's an urban myth, and you just can't do it. So that's a great place to start. Beyond that, beyond higher temperature, something you can play with is grind size. So if you grind your coffee a little more coarse, it's going to slow the extraction down. And sometimes, now this, I hesitate to get into grind size because it's so variable and you can have so many different experiences, but generally, if you grind your coffee a little bit coarser, you can give yourself an opportunity to have a more acidic cup. So my real advice would be to crank up your temperature, see how that works, and basically set it and forget it. If you want to play around a little bit more, try playing with your grind size. Maybe brew the same coffee 1, 2, 3 ways. Your normal grind size a little finer, and your grind size a little coarser, and see which one accentuates the acid in that coffee, keeping in mind that every coffee is super unique. We've talked all about that at length. You know, a washed Ethiopian coffee is going to have a really great opportunity to showcase its acid contents, given that you're bringing it at a high temperature across those 3 grind sizes, compared to if you were trying that with a naturally processed coffee from Mexico. You might want to temper your expectations for what changing your grind size can do. So I hope that answers your question. I hope you've learned something about acid today in this episode of the Tip Jar. You can ask your questions on Instagram. So the link is down there in the description, but it's just alexander.mills on Instagram. Every week or so, I give you an opportunity through my stories to ask a question. And then, like I said, I collect them all, post them 2 at a time. You vote with a poll, you select the question, and I just kind of ramble about it. So until next time, friends, keep brewing better coffee and be well.